Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 9th webinar of the Climate Toolkit. It's a pleasure to have all of you with us today. Our conversation today is on sustainable land care and ecological outreach. As stewards of the environment, it is our collective responsibility to manage our surrounding landscapes regeneratively in ways that align with nature while reducing our carbon footprint. These efforts include reducing our dependence on fossil fuel-based horticultural equipment, synthetic pesticides, and resource-intensive grass lawns, while emphasizing appropriate plant selection. We also have a great opportunity to inspire our communities and our guests to follow our lead. Should have mentioned that I'm Richard Piacentini. I'm the president and CEO for Phipps Conservatory and Botanical Gardens, and I'm really pleased to have all of you here with us today. Today, our guests are Andrea DeLong Amaya from the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, Dr. Sonia Skelly from Cornell Botanic Gardens, and Gabe Tylove and Juliet Alshok from Phipps Conservatory, who will discuss the climate case for demonstrating and communicating sustainable land management and holistic ecology to our surrounding communities. Before we get started, I wanted to report that the Toolkit is now 83 institutions strong, serving more than 55 million annual visitors. And we're excited to see that number continue to grow throughout 2023. As the presentation begins, you are welcome to use the Zoom chat function to enter questions, which we will answer after all the talks have concluded. And now, I'd like to introduce Andrea DeLong Amaya, Director of Horticulture at Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center in Austin, Texas, as our first speaker.
Okay, I think you should, can you hear me now? Well, thank you all for inviting me to be part of this. I'm very thrilled, and I wanted to also thank all of the participants on this webinar. Thank you all for the work you're doing to steward our natural world. It's really important work that everybody's doing. I'm part of the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and our mission is inspiring the conservation of native plants. And I wanted to talk about a couple techniques that we're using native plants for to solve particular problems. Namely, I'm going to talk about green roofs and ecological roadsides. And I'm assuming that probably most of you are familiar with basic benefits of green roofs, including reducing rainwater runoff and downstream flooding, improving water quality through filtration. Green roofs help with reducing energy consumption and the heat island effect in cities through transpiration or evaporative cooling, shading of roof surfaces, and plants and substrates serve as insulation also for the buildings. Plants are also going to be sequestering carbon and providing oxygen, all while creating critical habitat for wildlife in urban settings. And if you're lucky enough to have a view of a green roof, then they also provide that aesthetic benefit as well. Contemporary green roofs have largely been developed in temperate climates of Europe and North America. And in Texas, it's very hot. And so the green roofs here really require us to do a little bit more redesigning or rethinking of what those green roof systems would look like to be the most effective, because we have the leaves and the roots are exposed to extreme heat and long drought periods, sometimes followed by intense rainfall. So let's start with the substrate. Green roofs are not always green, right? For example, there are negative environmental impacts associated with sand mining, or perhaps the carbon footprint of transporting coconut coir. You know, we don't have coconut trees in the Austin area, so they'd have to be brought in from somewhere. So all of these things are drawbacks which can counter some of the benefits that we have of using green roofs. So the Wildflower Center saw this as an opportunity to do some research, and we developed a planting substrate that we call Sky System. And it's 100% recycled and locally available materials, including compost and crushed brick, for example. And it's intended to minimize the costs as well as roof load-bearing weight, reducing the load-bearing weight. It also helps with regulating temperature fluctuations, and that's always going to be better for plants. So speaking of plants, we selected species from our region that are adapted to these kind of stressful conditions. They're very drought resistant, highly efficient with their water use. They're adapted to both the soil and the air temperatures, particularly the heat. And they're also plants that can tolerate being saturated, having seasons where we get a lot of rain, and that we can get plants that are fairly waterlogged. So through our research, and the first slide I showed you on the green roofs showed you some of those test research plots those white boxes that we did. Through that research, we decided that there really were two suites of plants that do really well in a green roof kind of situation. One of them is using native succulents, and those are really best suited for places that don't have any irrigation. If irrigation is an option, then native herbaceous species work really well. So I can show you some examples of some of those projects that we worked on. This is the Dell Medical Center, the Wildflower Center. We're using the Sky Systems planting media, and we also used some of the native plants that I just mentioned. This is not irrigated. This project was based on the non-irrigated research plots that we did that they received no irrigation for several years. And so this is the succulent suite, including prickly pears, red yucca, manfreda, and then also some native wildflowers. And research shows that visible green space can facilitate faster recovery in hospital patients while also improving the well-being for staff and visitors. How cool is that? That's beautiful. This next project is a private residence that the Wildflower Center consulted on. We were involved with designing it along with the architects from Bercy Chen's studio here in Austin. The Sky System growing substrate was used. We also included soil inoculum from mature prairie remnants that was included in the compost that we used. And the primary goals were to restore native plant communities, help with water retention and thermal regulation for the roof of the residence. And what's interesting, you can see in this picture that there's a seamless transition from the surrounding planting area onto the roof. So it's just a continuous plane of prairie plantings. So in terms of outreach, a lot of these green roofs are visible in public places, including the Wildflower Center or places like the Dell Medical Center. There's another project that we worked on a while back that overlooked a green roof that you could see from the inside of a Starbucks cafe. So that was a beautiful amenity for that restaurant, and then others. We also have a number of publications in professional and trade magazines. So that is the summary of some of the green roof work we've done. So continuing the work by Mrs. Johnson on the roadside beautification, now we're jumping off of the roof and into the ditch. In fall of 2015, our Wildflower magazine highlighted native roadsides and ecological roadsides. And you can find the entire issue, the entire magazine of this issue is on the issue website. Issue is issuu.com. So you can read a lot of the articles, all of the articles that are in that magazine. Why roadsides? So federal and state agencies manage more than 17 million acres. That's not including the thousands of additional miles of roads that are maintained by the national parks and forests. And compare that to the 27 million acres of all of the national parks in the contiguous United States. So this is a great opportunity to do a lot of improvement. So managing roadsides appropriately will help with improving water and air quality as well as reducing the runoff. Sound is muffled, noise from the traffic, carbon is sequestered, and if you're using native plants, they themselves are then conserved, all while providing habitat for the declining animal species, including our charismatic monarch butterflies. The Xerces Society reports that roadsides can significantly contribute to the provision of habitat for honey and native bees that importantly pollinate so many of our crops. And also, again, if you're using native plants, you're going to be enriching that sense of place. We want Texas to look like Texas. So this project that you're looking at, well, let me back up. Let me just go through a list of best management practices for roadsides and some of the things that you might want to consider. First off is don't destroy what you already have, right? If you already have good habitat that exists, leave it alone and maintain it. reduce or adjust your mowing schedules to accommodate seed production and also to help minimize the stress on the plants. You want to avoid introducing non-native invasive species. This is huge. Whenever your site is mowed, you have the potential for introducing non-native species to your site, and that comes in on the mowing equipment. Plant locally appropriate native plants. And, if you can avoid the use of pesticides, including neonicotinoids, which are systemic insecticides that are known to poison insect pollinators. Okay, so the pictures that you're looking at here are from a project that the Wildflower Center actually wasn't involved with. This was a local Austin company called Environmental Survey Consulting. And full disclosure, the co-owner of this company is my spouse. So I got lots of insider information about it. This is a project that they did in the early to mid 90s. So this is about a 30-year-old project. It's about 20 acres. And the photos that you're looking at, the picture on the left shows you what one of the sites nearby looks like that was actually planted by a low bid contractor. And then you compare that to the image on the right, which was done by the Environmental Survey Consulting. And you can see, just looking at that image, just so much more diversity and richness. And let's see, next pictures. So here you can see this picture was taken just last Saturday. So this is like 30 years later, and you can see the richness of what's going on there. Not everything's blooming, but maybe you can see some different textures. One of the biggest tricks for doing this kind of project is in acquiring the species. So some of these plants were available commercially, and they were used as a base mix. And that included some of the earlier successional plants like common wildflowers, including also with grasses like green sprankletop, Cytotsgrama. And these are all great for stabilizing the site that made it better conducive to the later successional species. But it's those later successional species that are the hardest to come by, right? So what they had to do is do a lot of their harvesting themselves. And there are a variety of ways that they were doing this. You can see that there's a tractor reaper in the gizmo that's in the truck, and the bed of the truck is something that they hobbled together that they call the Grin Reaper, Grin as in smile. And that's basically a modified weed eater that has a box and a bag to collect the seed from, and then also just collecting seed by hand. Now, what you get from all of this, particularly with the tractor and the Grin Reaper, is an unprocessed and unsorted mix of species. You're going to have a lot of chaff in there, but that's okay. Some of these species are maybe even in just small amounts, but you can get a lot of, you can get things started, like even just a few plants can really spread and take over and get going. So some of the plants that came out of this were Liatris and Callilophus, and even Spiranthes orchids, which was pretty cool. And here's a picture where they're folding the seed in with a drag harrow with a chain mat, just to get some contact going there. So as you may or may not have surmised, I was not actually directly involved with most of these projects. I was more adjacent to them. So I'll do my best with any questions that you might have at the end of the webinar. At least I can try to point you in the right direction. And with that, I will say thank you and hand it off to the next speaker.
Thank you, Andrea. And for our second presentation, I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Sonia Skelly, Director of Education at Cornell Botanic Gardens, an adjunct professor, associate professor at Cornell University. Sonia.
Thank you. Andrea, can you stop sharing your screen, please? I would try to talk and present at the same time, but I have never been successful doing that. So, thank you. I'm very happy to be here and to tell you about a few projects that we have going on, and each one of them I could spend the whole time that we all have. So I'll try to be quick, and just to say that I'm happy to answer questions after the program or offline at another time. So I first wanted to start with a project that we have that we call the Climate Change Garden. And it started as what we called a creative experiment. And our goals and our questions were, could we come up with a program, a garden where we could inform visitors about climate change and what to expect. Could we physically demonstrate what might be happening on a local level and a regional level, so specific to upstate New York? And could we do that through the lens of plants? And then would that enable us with a mechanism to engage visitors and to help them see what was happening and to actually get them to engage directly with what they were seeing and provide some observations and opportunities for conversation? So with a team of faculty, staff at the gardens, and educators, we came together to come up with this plan. And we primarily were looking at this report from the New York State Energy Research and Development Authorities. It's called the Climate Report. And it's what we relied on to look at what was going to happen, what's predicted to happen in the next 20 years, 50 years, 100 years in our specific region, which is indicated there by the yellow star. And so we were in Region 3, the southern tier of New York State. And we looked at that and came up with some very discrete climatic predictions that we could use in a garden to talk about climate change and what we would see at our local level. And some of those, just to give you a quick summary of these, and the graphics that I'm sharing here were developed by our graphic designer, and then they are used on signs throughout the garden. So in our region, we're looking at an increase in overall average annual temperatures. And so by the 2050s, which is the time frame that we are looking at, we pegged 2050 because we felt like it was not too far off and people could somewhat imagine that time frame. So we're expected to have a 4 to 6 degree overall average temperature increase in our region. We are expected to have an increase in the number of days over 90. So when we started this project, when it says current here, we were only expected to have 7 days over 90 in the course of the year. Now, already in the early 2020s, we're seeing more of those numbers of days over 90 degrees, at which point, as most of you know, a lot of plants, there are physiological impacts too. And we're expected to have a greater frequency and duration of heat waves. So looking at 2 to 3 days over 90 degrees for a duration of 4 to 5 days. And this too has impact on plants. And so and one more, which is the annual increase in precipitation. So we're expected to have 4 to 10% more precipitation in 2050. And for us, it's predicted to come over winter as opposed to over summer. And what we're starting to see is that we're having more drought in the late spring, early summer, and more precipitation and less snowfall. So that has impact for us in terms of the ground and what's protected, what's killed off invasive insects and plants of that species. So these are things that we are showing in the garden, or attempting to show in the garden, which is, this was the schematic design for it. So this was half the garden is outside in what we call the garden of today, and half of the garden is under a high tunnel, which was a relatively inexpensive structure for us to purchase and erect in the space. And the beds outside and inside are identical. So they're planted with the same exact plants inside and outside, but each bed is different. So see if I can get my cursor here. So this grouping of plants and this grouping of plants are the same. And we settled on 2 types of plants. We looked at food crops because everybody who visits can relate to food and vegetables and things that we may have an impact or we may not see as a result of climate change. And then the other food crop that we looked at were plants that were specifically for pollinators. So pollinator specific plants and food plants for humans. And this is an image of the garden. And just to go from schematic to actual, and to give you a sense of what the beds look like there. And what we do is we use this as a way to engage with visitors, to have them look. You see all of the individual interpretive signs there, and they are managed on a year-by-year basis. So whatever the crops that are in there for that particular year, we've developed interpretation that says why these plants are there, what impact we may have as a result. And we ask visitors to engage directly with looking at and observing what they see outside. And then when they transition inside, to look at the same plants and see if they can see differences. And the sign here on the right gives you some of the big picture ideas that I just covered with all those graphics. So it paints a picture of what we're likely to see. Just a few images of what we observe, and we try to point out to visitors if they're there. We looked at wheat as a potential, this is winter wheat, and what it looked like in 2050 and what it looked like in the garden of today. And one of the lessons that we've learned from this project is that there's winners and losers, and some years the garden of today, it doesn't do as well as the garden of tomorrow. So because we're using plants and we can't always, this is somewhat of a controlled experiment, but not in the same sense of, it's not completely controlled as we would do, say, in a greenhouse facility. So we talk about what winners and losers, both things that are going to do well in with these changes, but also things that are not going to do poorly. And we've replaced this particular crop with Kernza to talk about a perennial grain crop that has, looks like it will have some better resistance to drought and maybe a better source of food crops for to replace things like winter wheat, which won't do well in wet, cold springs, which is what we have now. And this is an example of some of the day-to-day interpretation that we put into the garden as things are happening on a particular day or a given week, just so that whomever may be visiting that day can see what's happening. They don't have to come back time after time to talk about what's happening. If there's excessive heat, if it's affecting fruit set, or it's causing it to, we've had broccoli there where the heads of broccoli will be very uneven and not uniform, and that detracts from the farmer's ability to sell it. These are some of the pollinator crops that we had, and just from this image you can see that they're doing better in the climate of today than they are doing in the climate that we're manifesting under the high tunnel, which I didn't mention at the beginning, but the high tunnel is where we close it up, we make it hotter in there, so that we're approximating that 4 to 6 degree increase in temperature, so that it's approximating what is likely to happen in that climate. And then this is one of the ways that we've very low tech way of getting visitors to engage. And we've provided these pens and these signs and directly asked them to tell us what you think. Are these just looking at the plants in front of you? What do you see? And there are lots of opportunities for this, both in terms of asking questions, asking for their observations, something very simple as this, to get some feedback, and we capture them regularly in the garden. And this is just to give you a sense of the scale for people there. I want to jump to the next one because I love this sign. And this for me is a key way that as they walk into the greenhouse structure, we're telling them that, okay, we're in the middle of a heat wave, we're simulating a heat wave, and it's very hot. And when people walk in, especially when it's hot, the first thing they want to do is escape. And if I'm leading the tour, I'm standing in front of them and I'm blocking the exit. And so I stand there and I talk to them and I say this very thing. So it's very hot in here. We're going to get to leave and we're going to be grateful that we get to walk out of here. But imagine the plants, they can't leave. So what are the things that are happening to the plants themselves? And what are we likely to see as a result of it? And so that sometimes I think it's not the plants that are the lens, but this feeling, because when you walk into this interior structure, it is much, much warmer than outside. And the one last thing I want to say about this, because I want to just share one other program that we are working on, is we've done some we've partnered with a communication researcher in looking at how we can measure whether we're adjusting the dial at all. And one of the interesting outcomes from this is that when we've surveyed visitors who've gone through the garden and those who haven't, that the garden seems to be having an influence on how people think about climate change. And what's particularly interesting is that the more conservative their political values, the greater the change that we've been able to indicate as a result of going through the garden. So we're keen to keep looking at that and getting our numbers up on it so that we can look at it and discern a significant difference before we go and publish that. So one of the other programs that we have is we call it's Learning by Leading. It's a program that originated at the University of California, Davis, and we have 3 teams at Cornell Botanic Gardens. And one of them is called our Sustainable Landscape team. And these students, they're college students. There are 10 students on this team, and they're working directly with our staff in designing and implementing and maintaining sustainable landscapes. So I have this picture here because the young woman in the orange and brown shirt there is a landscape architecture student. And so many of the students in this team are landscape architecture students, plant science, natural resources, and they're getting direct experience doing some of the things that we get to do on a day-to-day basis. But we're giving them direct experience in designing, coming up with plant selection, understanding how to prep a site appropriately, so that why it's important to remove lawn and what benefits we're going to receive from that. All of the plants that are going in here are all native plants. And so we talked to them a lot about what the importance of native plants are, and especially from both a reducing our carbon footprint state, but also these are all pollinator positive plants. And so we're trying to really increase the biodiversity across campus. This is just a picture of the installation a few months after installation. And these are the students, and they were celebrated at the dedication. So it was great to have them there. And as a result of that, we were invited to create another garden on campus. This is with the American Indian and Indigenous Studies residential house. And so our students work directly with them to understand what plants that were important to their communities across the US, not just our local indigenous Gayocono, and to plant native plants at the site that would be both sacred and of a healing origin. So they're getting experience again, doing research about the plants, coming up with the designs for them, and they'll be installing it next week. So they were here learning about planting and seed selection in our greenhouse. And the final thing I just want to share is that we do this work all the time, and sometimes it takes a lot of effort, and we're not sharing it in all the ways that we can. So we've recently put together this part of our website that aggregates all of the information that we have that we can share publicly, so that we point to ways in which we have a native lawn site. We have different ways we manage our water, a lot of different pollinator plants across campus and pollinator specific gardens, as well as how we control pests through our integrative plant management program, and how we control invasive threats and how we can get the homeowner to do it. So that's my quick run through. I'm happy to talk with you all later about it if you're interested. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. And now for our final presentation, I'm pleased to introduce Gabe Tylo, our Director of Adult Education and Community Outreach, and Juliet Alshak, Sustainable Landcare Program Coordinator at Phipps Conservatory. Gabe and Julia.
Thanks, Richard, and thanks to our other speakers. Phipps does have a number of examples on campus that reflect some of the things that Sonia or Andrea covered. And so we thought, instead of kind of circling back to some of those things, both in my role as adult education director and with Juliet, we wanted to talk more about how to translate some of those examples into what happens in the residential garden. And that's really where Juliet and I focus, sort of taking, what should the visitor do next, and what resources can we provide? For us, we're looking at helping to increase diversity, plant diversity in the landscape, with more of an emphasis on natives or really resilient plants. We're looking at stormwater management. Pittsburgh already has difficulty slowing and infiltrating stormwater, and storms in our area are only going to become more challenging for our infrastructure. We're looking to increase edible landscapes so that people sort of connect more with their land and are eating more locally. And also thinking about landscape management. So how are we reducing our reliance on fossil fuels for running our equipment or for our fertilizers, just sort of thinking more organically about our approach. So we're going to run through a number of programs. Juliet's going to start by talking about our landscaper training program, and then I'll follow up with a quick overview of some of the other supportive programs that wrap around to kind of capture everybody. So Juliet, I'll hand things off to you.
Sure. And first, I wanted to just define, what do we mean by sustainable land care? Sustainable land care is caring for the land in a way that mimics natural systems and creates healthy soil, plants, and people. And with that, we've developed 9 principles that really guide, what it means to be, practicing sustainable land care. So anywhere from thinking about our observations and how we understand our property before selecting plants and planting, but then, how can we increase biodiversity, conserve air quality and water quality, produce an abundance, and all while, creating beautiful gardens. And so the sustainable land care, this is really the foundation of the programs. So our main program for local landscapers is the Sustainable Land Care Accreditation Program. So this is a locally branded accreditation program. So, any local landscapers have the Phipps brand behind them, if they've gone through our training. And, locally in Western Pennsylvania, Phipps is known for, excellence in horticulture and environmental sustainability. And so we help to, educate these local practitioners and then, share and really highlight the work that they do with, with our visitors. So this all starts with an accreditation training. So it's an annual training that we do that focuses on organic and sustainable practices. And this is open to, we really want to attract local landscapers, either those who are already practicing sustainable methods or those who are curious and want to learn better practices. What really excites me is that we've also been able to attract, grounds crew from the city of Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh, so local universities and nonprofits get a reduced rate to attend the training. And so we've been able to access just a really great diverse group of people. Since the pandemic, our training has, part of it is online. And so with that, we're also able to reach not just Western Pennsylvania. We've had students in Ohio and down to the DC area who've also gone through the training. The training is our program is built off of NOFA's organic land care standards. So NOFA is the Northeastern Organic Farmers Association. They've created organic land care standards, and this is what we build our program sort of around. And so the outcomes of the course is to understand these standards and how they're set up. The standards themselves have required or approved practices and practices that are not allowed. And so it's important for students to understand that. They go through the training, pass an exam, and then a big part of it is really connecting with other practitioners that are also doing sustainable practices. So we've been able to develop a great mix of landscapers and people that are able to connect with each other and learn from each other. The accreditation program has 2 levels, and I won't go into a ton of detail here, but just to say that if you have a local landscape business, you know, there's a business level, and then there's also sort of a supporter or an advocate level, you know, those who aren't offering local landscaping practices and businesses themselves. Those who are business accredited, you know, they go through this process. Like I said, they take the course, they pass an exam. Every year they keep up with training, and so we offer you know, workshops and additional training on sustainable land care and focusing on different aspects. So we've had you know, we had a workshop on stormwater management. This year we're getting ready for a pollinator garden workshop, and so the you know, local practitioners can continue with their education through us. And I guess lastly, just to say that, you know, then with this accreditation, we promote them through our website and, you know, are sharing their work with our visitors. I want to pass it over to Gabe, and he's going to talk about some of our other programs as a part of the Sustainable Land Care program.
Yeah, thanks, Juliet. So the Landcare accreditation is geared towards professionals, but we understand that a lot of homeowners are interested in this work as well. And so we have a pretty robust adult education program. Within that, we have 2 certificates in ecological gardening and landscape and garden design. Those are, you don't have to enroll in those certificates. You can take single sessions of that, or you can sort of go through, you know, about a year or 2 of coursework in order to achieve your certificate. So we see a lot of homeowners in those classes. And then also, this is a great continuing education opportunity for our professionals as well. You can go to the next slide, Juliet. Another way that we've found to influence what's being planted in our landscape is through a native plant sale. I'm sure a lot of institutions out there, especially gardens, may be familiar with this concept. For us, this was relatively new, but we have an online pre-order of these native plant plugs. You can see a sort of an example above. You can get either in strips of 4 or 5. We also have preset packages available. One of the things that's really exciting about this for us is, you know, I know sometimes programmatically people are worried about, you know, okay, well, how do I add this into my budget? Well, for us, this has actually been a really strong educational fundraiser. So, you know, this has been net positive, as well as getting this year about 8,000 plants into the landscape. I'll just also say, this has been relatively easy to implement. I mean, there were, this is our second year. Year 1 was a little bit of a learning curve, but we work with a wholesale plant broker. And so we let them know about a month ahead what plants we need. They order everything for us from a range of nurseries. We get the plants in about a week ahead of the sale. We get everything labeled and cut and prepped, and then we hand them out to people. So there's very little waste, there's very little care, and it's a win-win for everybody. We've also turned this in the pickup into a community event. So we're calling it our plant book and art sale. If you're in the area, you can come by next week. And it's exposing a lot of our membership to our education center. So a lot of people are members and just, you know the conservatory as a place for our shows, but by connecting to our education center, they're sort of deepening their connection to our programs. At that event, we'll have master gardeners there through our Ask Dr. Phipps table. This is another way that we inform our guests. So we're at community events as well as in the conservatory 2 days a week. And so this is just a way for us to share sustainable land care information with more casual visitors. You can see on the table there, they've got a number of different resources, including 2 big posters. Those are our top 10 sustainable plant posters. I think I talk more about them on the next slide. So this is a program that we've had since 2008. Every year, our horticulture staff works with the education team to put together a list of top 10 sustainable plants for that year. And that's a mix of trees, shrubs, and perennials that we think are really well adapted to our area. There's a preference for native, although it's not exclusively native. We also have edible plants, just sort of really good garden performers, things that are naturally sort of pest resistant, don't require a lot of care after establishment. They're just going to do really well in our garden. So we've done that since 2008. And a few years ago, we transformed that into an online searchable database, our sustainable plant finder. And so that's on our website now. And we know a number of local landscapers or designers who use that in our region as a way to kind of diversify their plant palette. We also have begun putting together more targeted lists. So last year we had top 10 bulbs and top 10 fall bloomers as a way to help people think about having blooms more of the year as a way of supporting pollinators. And then this year we'll be focusing on deer-resistant plants and plants for hillsides. Hillsides especially are really challenging in our area, and we want to make sure people are getting them planted in a way that reduces erosion and landslides. We also revamped a couple of checklists this year. It's our lawn and garden checklist. So these are sort of simple one-pager ways to think about either how to maintain your own landscape in an ecologically beneficial way, or how to talk to a lawn and garden care provider, so a landscaper who maybe hasn't had any training, or and this way it gives you some key talking points to feel more confident guiding that conversation with the landscaper. The last program I'll talk about is our Sustainable Garden Awards. This is something we developed in 2020. Everyone was home in their garden. We didn't have a great way to connect with everyone. And so we were also really interested in seeing more of what was happening in our region at a residential scale. When people come to the conservatory, we do have great example gardens, outdoor gardens, but we know there's a lot of creativity happening in the residential sphere. And so we wanted a way both to connect to it and to celebrate it, to help people think more broadly about what can happen in a residential space, essentially. So this was a way to find those people and to highlight them. And you can go to the next slide, Juliet. We developed 5 categories for awards. You can see them listed there. Importantly, we also connected with one of the local newspapers as a media partner. So the newspaper will advertise the program. They send a photographer out to capture all the winners and announce all the winners in the newspaper. And then we also invite all of our winners and announce them at our fall Native Plant and Sustainability Conference that we've been running for over 20 years. And so, we picked these categories as a way to sort of showcase a range of what we mean by sustainable landscaping. So you can see native plants and wildlife gardens, gardens that manage rainwater. Oh, yeah, perfect. Thanks, Juliet. So I'll just show you quick glimpses of winners from the past. This is our native plantings and wildlife gardens. And we're looking both at people who are doing fun things with natives, as well as seeing their spaces as refuge for wildlife. Here's an example of gardens that manage rainwater. This is a huge area of growth in Pittsburgh. There's been a lot of rain barrel programs and beginning to be more thoughtfulness about how each landscape through a rain garden or other sort of downspout diversion can capture and infiltrate water. This is actually a relatively new landscape, just planted a year or two ago, but turns out it's just a few blocks from our education center. So we'll actually be connecting with this homeowner in the future to do tours to help educate more folks about what they can do in their space. Micro gardens is actually just one of our most fun categories. We get a ton of creativity in a small space. We are in the city, and we want people to know that they can make really lush, vibrant spaces, places that produce food, places that support pollinators, places that sort of provide the mental wellness that green spaces can do, even in tiny spaces. The more people can grow edibles in their backyard, the less they need to buy from the store, and they can reduce their footprint. And so just showing examples of what that can look like in really wild and perennial ways. Sometimes a lot of fruit trees, a lot of pollinator plants mixed in with edibles. People also shared pictures of their canning cupboards and sort of how they're preserving that food. So we're beginning to tell stories about what interacting with the local landscape can look like from a food vantage point. And then finally, we have a broad category called Gardens for Personal Retreat. This is the most open category, and it has connected us with some really photo-worthy landscapes in our region. And also just some really amazing gardeners. The fun thing about this story here is this couple created a really lush space in what was a completely black-topped area. And so again, just using this as an opportunity to tell stories about what's possible in our region. So that's it for us. Juliet and I will be sticking around and happy to answer any additional questions. I know Joe will be, they'll be sending out our contact information after if there's any additional questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabe and Juliet. At this time, we'll open the floor to questions, and our Climate Toolkit manager, Andrew Lample, will moderate the questions, beginning with any questions that are currently in the chat. Andrew.
Thanks, Richard, and thank you all to our presenters. A really amazing work, really inspiring presentations all around. Please feel free to drop a question into the chat, which I will moderate for the next few minutes. To get started, I'll throw out a question to the entire group. In your collective experiences, what have been some of the largest barriers or points of resistance to a wider scale adoption of regenerative, ecologically based landscaping practices in our communities? And that's both for residential homeowners and landscape gardening companies.
One of the things we've experienced at the gardens is we are constantly asked where homeowners can get native plants. So they're picking up on the message that we're promoting, but they're unclear where they can get them and get the kinds of ones that we have. So like Phipps, we've started to collect and grow our own for native plant sales, and our student teams are engaged in that. But I would love to hear, Gabe, about your sources of native plants for sales, because I thought that was a great idea. So there's interest, but there's not some of our local providers aren't providing all of the plants.
I can kind of go next. The thought that I had, especially for our local landscapers, the biggest barrier has been aesthetics and just like people. I spoke with a local landscaper who he's like, I don't even work in this area anymore because because he does organic lawn care, and he's like what they want their lawns to look like and what they're used to as far as like the regiment of amendments and things being added. He's like, I just won't work there anymore, and so it's been very hard to just change the understanding of aesthetics, that like a little bit longer grass, a little bit lusher can be much more healthier and doesn't need additional fertilizers, synthetic fertilizers and pesticides and things like that. So that's definitely been a challenge.
Well, I'll just jump in. I think one of the problems that I see that folks have is just understanding how to manage the landscape that's using native plants. For example, in our case with native plants, a lot of people aren't familiar with them if they've come in from other parts of the country or even other parts of the world, and they're not used to gardening in our climate with our soils, with our plants. And most of the plants that are used commonly in the horticulture trade are kind of generalists and are easy to grow. Partly that's why they're successful, right? And they, not just that they're easy to grow, but that they're flexible enough and generalist enough to grow in different parts of the country. Whereas in our area, the conditions are so extreme that our plants are specialized, and so people will plant bluebonnets in a very richly composted garden soil, thinking that's a good thing, but they don't do well. They just grow and get floppy and lots of mildew, and they're not happy. And so a lot of that's what we're trying to do is educate people on how do you take care of this stuff. And actually, a lot of the time, it's a lot easier. You just don't necessarily need to do the things that you used to do with the other plants that you were coddling. So that's one of the challenges that we've had.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We had a question come into the chat, which piggybacks off what everybody's saying. Do you have any advice on finding a native plant broker?
I can tell you how we found ours. I attended a local native plant conference. And a part of that conference, there was a big room with tons and tons of plant vendors. and, just going to all the tables and chatting. And I met the people from ISIL there. And then what we, ended up doing was when we had our workshop for planting for, rainwater management, I reached out to ISIL and they tabled at our event, and then that relationship kind of continued from there. But yeah, I found them from attending a native plant conference, so that was a neat find.
I've also found that sometimes we can contact a local grower and have them contract grow stuff. It may be that we need to help them find the propagules, but depending on what that is, they may or may not already have that, but that's an easy way to just contract it in advance.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Well, we are, in the interest of time, gonna cut our Q&A session, but if you have any other questions, we'll be sending out an email after the recording is complete with the contact information of all of our speakers, as well as my contact information, so you can relay questions to me or any of our guests today. Thank you so much to Andrea, Sonia, Gabe, and Juliet, and now we'll turn it back to Richard for his closing remarks.
Thank you, Andrew. And I'd also like to thank our speakers and all of our attendees for joining us today. This is really important work to, really motivate our communities to, thinking about the landscapes that they take care of in a climate-friendly way. So thank you for all the work you're doing, and we look forward to keeping in touch with all of you. Thank you.